Good evening. My name is Pat Lupo. I'm a member of the Benedictine Sisters of Erie, an environmental educator at the Neighborhood Art House, and co-chair of HECA, Hold Erie Koch Accountable. A few reminders before we begin. Please silence your cell phones and be courteous in all discussions. If you did not receive an index card and pencil for questions after the presentations, if you raise your hands now, there'll be folks around to give them to you. Questions will be collected halfway through the presentations and again at the end. If you did not sign the contact sheet for our e-newsletter and emails on your way in, please do so as you leave. Also, please sign the resolution, which is the City Council resolution for the Pennsylvania DEP. They are on the large 11 by 17 pieces of paper on the tables. There are also copies of HECA newsletters and Erie readers on the table outside the auditorium. Restrooms are located outside the auditorium and to your left. I want to welcome you to the Erie Koch Community Impact Update. We are here this evening to inform you on Erie Koch's ongoing violations and the high-stakes impact for Erie's quality of life. The speakers this evening represent HECA, Hold Erie Koch Accountable, a local grassroots organization, and GASP, the Group Against Smog and Pollution, a citizens group in Southwest PA. A panel of environmental scientists will address Erie Koch's operation and the impact on air and water quality. Panelists will also discuss the recent closing of Erie Koch's sister plant in Tonawanda, New York, and present insights into the ongoing enforcement actions by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. I want to thank you for joining us this evening. It is imperative that you, the citizens of Erie, be ready to participate in the public meetings and a hearing that DEP will be hosting as part of Erie Koch's application for a Title V operating permit. The state environmental justice policy also triggers an enhanced public participation process in recognition of the decades of the plant's violations in the sensitive downwind communities. We will begin our program with an informational on the Erie Koch plant, which was just produced by Menagerie this week.
This particular area is actually a wonderful place for wildlife. If the environment was cleaner, it could be even better. It could be just as great a hot spot as over at Presque Isle.
I sit out on the deck with friends and suddenly this horrific acidic smell comes through. Now, smell is one thing, but what's contained within that acrid smoke, that's the scary part.
When you breathe in fine particulate matter, it can go into your bloodstream and it can contribute to heart disease and other problems.
No one, of course, is immune to air pollution, but there are some populations that are even more vulnerable, and that includes our young children whose bodies and brains and lungs are still developing, the elderly, and those with underlying health conditions that may already have asthma or COPD or a heart condition. Being exposed to air pollution, especially fine particulates, can be deadly.
At Tonawanda, there were high levels of benzene detected in the community.
We knew our air smelled very badly and we were sick. What worked for us is citizen science, so we collected data that was the smoking gun that we needed to find out what was in our air, number one, and where it was coming from.
We're being rained on with bad air, and someone has to see the damage that it does and see this as an opportunity with awareness and education that we can counteract that. We just don't sacrifice the people who live in the community with their ignorance.
If you notice the color of the soil here, it's a black color, and that's not natural. I mean, if we took this soil and had it analyzed, I wouldn't be surprised if we found high concentrations of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. That's not a healthy thing for the organisms that live in the soil, and for people that garden or children playing on playgrounds or in their backyard nearby, we have no idea whether or not there's potential exposure to contaminants in the soil that could be just as bad for people as it is for the living creatures that are here.
Our cancer risk at one point was 70 times the guidelines.
This is what gives me the worst chills about this place, because all that water you see there is almost always like that. That is probably the water table, which means that wherever the water table flows, then those contaminants flow with it. That is probably ending up in Lake Erie somewhere. We've seen dead and dying birds over there. I have a video of a mallard duck that flew in there one day when I was spotting birds, and it died right on the water by the permitted discharge. I do a lot of birding other places, and I don't find dead carcasses of birds at those other places. Here we do.
We weren't out to shut Tonawanda down. We didn't want anyone to lose their jobs.
It's a false narrative to say, well, it's jobs, so we'll put up with pollution. We don't have to do that. We can still have great jobs and a healthy environment.
We know the before and after, and it's considerably improved.
Until something like this is cleaned up, I don't see how we could ever expect the sorts of economic benefits of tourism on this side of town that we have on that side.
Everyone should care. There's an economic element to this challenge. There's certainly a health issue to this challenge, and that will impact ultimately everything that we're all trying to do, which is, grow Erie into the best possible version that it's ever been.
My primary concerns are with Erie Coke in the realm of water pollution issues. I came to Erie in 1984 with my wife and our one child, and have been a student of the water resources of our fine community ever since then, and on numerous occasions have found it valuable to be able to take students down to the lake and learn about the fish and the birds and the other creatures that live in the water. And in the last 6 months, having turned a strong focus on the prospect of Erie Coke having its NPDES permits renewed, which are permits for the water that it legally, because of the permit, discharges into Lake Erie. And I've become concerned about some of the things that I see happening that seem to be okay as far as our government regulators are concerned. Here again is this image where you can see the gray smudge of Erie Coke's footprint right along the shores of Lake Erie. And the four primary concerns that I have with water pollution I've listed here in order of importance in my mind. My biggest concern is the fact that contaminants that are generated and have been generated on the site for over 90 years could quite likely be transported through the relatively permeable soils that occur there and could be reaching the water table. And if it gets into the water table, groundwater flows downhill, just like water at the surface, and it could be entering Lake Erie at places we don't even know. I want to briefly comment on the NPDES permitted discharge. They have two different pipes that discharge their cooling water to Lake Erie, and at one of those that is easily accessible from the East Avenue boat launch, I've seen some things that I'm very much concerned about affecting fish and wildlife. There are ongoing problems, and have been for several years, with Erie Coke's discharge of its industrial pretreatment waters to the Erie Wastewater Treatment Plant, which is our public treatment facility. And we've also seen, just in the last 4 or 5 months, some issues with contaminants that Erie Coke has been responsible for releasing into the area surrounding its operation on the streets nearby. All right, so first focusing on the on-site issues that I believe could be contributing to some groundwater concerns. Area A is a place that I believe is known as the coal hole to DEP and to folks working at Erie Coke. It's the area where the rail cars come in and offload coal, and it's basically stored there temporarily until it can be prepared to be loaded into the coke ovens. And for many, many decades, coal, as you know, is not necessarily anything very clean. And if you investigate the known contaminants that leach through coal into underlying soil and water, it includes a wide variety of metals and organic pollutants, which are not good for either the soil or aquatic life. And I'll show a picture next of what that area looks like. Area B is the area that recently was in the news because of the spill of wastewater, which occurred in mid-March, and that was followed a few weeks later by a major rupture of a wastewater tank that spilled a variety of contaminants onto the ground. There's no containment underneath those wastewater tanks that would prevent those chemicals from soaking into the soil and reaching the water table. This is what the coal hole looks like from the hill to the south of Erie Coke. And the water that you see there at the surface, every time I stop here and peek in, you see the same water that's ponded at the surface in the coal hole. And if that water is always ponded at the surface, it's probably because it's a low-lying area and the water table is exposed right there. So any of the contaminants that would leach out of the coal or whatever other material is spilled into the coal hole is being transmitted into the water table, which ultimately, it would be a miracle if it leaded anywhere other than Lake Erie. So this is my biggest concern as an aquatic scientist with Erie Coke. Back in the October of 2017, I was able to participate in an early stakeholder group meeting that DEP had convened, and Paul Safran, the owner of Erie Coke and the grandson of J.D. Crane that owned Erie Coke before Safran took over, was present. And I asked Mr. Safran and his plant manager if they had anything in place underneath the operations there that would prevent contaminants from penetrating into the soil, and his answer was simply no. So that tells me that anything that penetrates the surface of the soil is likely going to be entering into the ground. And this is just a close-up photograph of that second area with a big circle around the tank, which I believe is the 101 tank that ruptured a couple of weeks ago. The contaminants that DEP identified in that rupture included benzene, naphthalene, ammonia, and cyanide, and these are not things that you put in your coffee in the morning, and these are certainly not things that aquatic life would flourish in if it is entering into Lake Erie. And it's these same chemicals that are normally treated in these wastewater industrial pretreatment systems here before they're discharged to our public water supply or our public wastewater treatment system. And I know from conversations with the people at wastewater treatment that they've been having problems for the last several years with Erie Coke not properly treating these materials, and the chemical contaminants being in far in excess of what they're supposed to be. So I wonder if that could compromise how our wastewater treatment plant operation is able to cost effectively treat the domestic sewage that it receives from all of us. This is just the top part of the most recent administrative order which DEP issued just a couple of weeks ago, and this was for the violations associated with the ruptured tank. I was pleased to see that DEP noted the Solid Waste Management Act and Clean Streams Law at the top of this administrative order, because those are the two laws, one a federal law, the other one a state law, which would indicate that DEP is looking at the likelihood of there being groundwater contamination issues with this latest rupture. And it's not like this is the first time something like this has ever happened. I spent some time at DEP at the Northwest Regional Office with Ann Helms, a student of mine and a student at Gannon University, and we saw numerous records in the DEP files of other spills that have occurred at Erie Coke, which we just didn't find out about. If you don't understand or have never learned a little bit of hydrology, I just wanted to show an illustration of the nature of groundwater and how it relates to surface water. Groundwater is basically invisible lakes and streams that are below the surface of the soil and the rocks that we walk upon and drive upon. And groundwater, of course, is what you tap into if you have a well and you get your own water from beneath your land. No one could certainly safely use water that would come from a well in the vicinity of Erie Coke. And I know that because a property owner nearby told me that he tried to make a well that he could use for his own purposes to operate a fish culturing facility where he sells bait, and he detected benzene, which it would have been unsafe to use for growing his fish. So water that gets into the ground ultimately connects to surface water. And as I've said before, this water table that we see exposed at Erie Coke has to connect with surface water as it goes downslope, and downslope from Erie Coke is Lake Erie. Here's a diagram that kind of represents a typical profile of an area where there have been contaminants or waste materials disposed of on the surface, and how water leaching through these materials eventually enters into the water table and then moves to surface waters nearby. We don't know, I don't have any specific facts about groundwater contamination with Erie Coke because there's never been any testing. There have never been any monitoring wells drilled, and I asked DEP about this, and they had some of their employees check the files, and it amazes me that it's never been investigated before. I looked into other coke operations throughout the United States to find out if there are known groundwater contamination issues with other coke manufacturing operations, and I've not been able to find one yet that doesn't have groundwater contamination associated with it. Every single one of these coke facilities, many of which are now shut down and some of them now Superfund sites, had significant groundwater concerns. This is a laundry list to summarize the kinds of contaminants that typically occur in groundwater with coke facilities, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are always present in the contaminated groundwaters, also benzene and cyanide and arsenic, which you recognize as poisons. So if the groundwater is contaminated with these things, then that at one time or another is going to have to be cleaned up. Where the heated water is discharged to Lake Erie, just west of the East Avenue boat launch, for the last 3 winters with a student named Emma Mader, we have been documenting large-scale congregations of fish that are attracted to the too warm water. Because these fish are more comfortable, like we would be in warmer temperatures in the winter, they congregate there. And you find literally hundreds of fish concentrated in this little cove next to the East Avenue boat launch, and the water typically, it stratifies with warm water at the surface and cold water at the bottom, and when the fish swim in there, they suffer temperature shock, especially because it's not a consistent warm temperature. The temperature varies from hour to hour, from warmer to cooler, and fish can't handle that sort of temperature variation. This winter, I think the fish kill was especially pronounced. We would go down there every other week and find typically 50 to 100 more dead fish, and of course lots of seagulls feeding on the dead fish. And then in late March, we were especially concerned because the fish, as they were dying, were showing signs of other problems besides temperature shock. And we found many dozens of fish that had blood showing on their skin and around their face, which we have a preliminary determination from a pathologist that these fish are suffering from viral hemorrhagic septicemia, which is not a good disease to have in a concentrated area here because that virus can affect other fish species too. So I'm very worried about the fish and the wildlife that we see there, and finally the off-site contaminants. If any of you were on the port access road back in late November, Erie Coke was hauling some of its product out from a gate on just a dirt road, and they were depositing some of their product and some of the dirty soil from their roadway all over the port access road. And when they cleaned it up, they effectively washed it into the storm drains, which I believe lead over to Mill Creek. So that ended up in the bay too. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up now so others can speak as well.
I'd now like you to welcome Rachel Filippini, the Executive Director of GASP, the Group Against Smog and Pollution. Rachel, a tireless advocate for cleaner air and healthier communities, is a prime example of professionalism and leadership. She has served as GASP's Executive Director since 2004. Rachel?
I'm happy to be here tonight, and I've come with one of our attorneys, Ned Mulcahy, as well as our communications manager, and I just want to thank Hold Erie Coke Accountable for inviting us to participate this evening. A little bit about GASP first. Group Against Smog and Pollution actually is celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. We work to improve air quality in southwestern Pennsylvania through education, advocacy, policymaking, and legal work. And I'm confident in saying over the lifetime of GASP, over the past 5 decades, working on coke-making facilities has been a big part of what we've focused on over the years. Whether we're looking at their permits or their compliance data or just understanding the kind of pollutants they emit into the air and the type of violations you see from these types of facilities, we have quite a bit of experience and expertise. And can we please put on my slides? Thank you. So we have experience with this, and we were delighted that Hold Erie Coke Accountable would invite us to come up and work with them to delve in a little bit more deeply, looking at Erie Coke and their air quality violations and helping to prepare the community as we get ready for the Title V operating permit public hearing, which will hopefully be happening later this year or early next. GASP would not be able to be up here tonight and participate without the support of several Erie residents who have donated to us, as well as the Black Family Foundation and Sierra Club Lake Erie Group. So let's first just start by talking a little bit about air quality in Erie County in general. Nope. Oh. Actually, before we do that, let's talk about why we care. So GASP has been around for 5 decades. You would think after 5 decades we could have got this figured out, right? So air quality over the past 5 decades across the United States has improved significantly. But we also know that air pollution continues to make people sick, shortens lives, and impacts people's quality of life significantly. If you can't go outside for a run or enjoy Prescal, enjoy the outdoors because of something you're smelling or tasting in the air, or it's causing your throat to get scratchy, that's affecting your quality of life. If you want to have your windows open on a nice evening, but you can't because of the stench that's blowing in, that's affecting your quality of life. If you're worried about your children playing outside, that's affecting your quality of life. We know that new research shows that air pollution affects us socially through decreased productivity, school attendance, and lifetime earnings. So if children are having asthma attacks and missing school, and their parents have to miss work to take care of them, that means that child is missing opportunities to learn, and their parents are missing opportunities to earn. And that affects the whole family and the whole community in the long run. We also know that people and companies aren't going to want to move to an area where air quality is poor. You have a lot of wonderful amenities here, a lot of great universities, but will the students want to stay here with their degrees and get a job and buy a house and raise a family if the air quality and the water quality are not up to par? So what is the state of Erie County's air in general? So what do I have to compare it to? We're based out of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. In general, air quality in Erie County is fairly good. The State of the Air report put out by the American Lung Association each year gives Erie County an A for particulate matter. But you get a C when it comes to ozone pollution. And so there are still significant areas for improvement here. And one of the things this report isn't able to capture is the fact that it's looking at air monitoring data. Well, there just aren't that many air monitors in Erie County. And so it doesn't capture potential hotspots of pollution and places where people live downwind of large stationary sources such as Erie Coke. So while air quality, there's a lot of good things about it in Erie County as compared to some other areas like Allegheny County. Part of the reason for that is that you don't have the same number of sources as Allegheny County. And you also have a flatter terrain where air pollution is going to be pushed out of the area and not trapped in river valleys. But there are still many opportunities for improvement in problem areas and hotspots. So I'm going to talk briefly about air pollution and how it affects health, and then Ned Mulcahy is going to talk more specifically about Erie Coke. So we know that air pollution has improved significantly over the past many years all across the United States thanks to the Clean Air Act, but we also know that air pollution still remains a significant health threat, and many millions of Americans are living in areas where their air is poor and where it's affecting public health. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, over 20 million school days and work days are lost each year due to air pollution, and there's an estimated excess mortality of 125,000 deaths per year nationwide. And more than 122 million people are living in counties where they're not meeting the national ambient air quality standards for one or more air pollutants. And so when we think about air quality, naturally I think a lot of people think about asthma and respiratory health. And of course, air pollution is linked to asthma. But it's linked to so many other things happening in your body. Everything from asthma to heart attacks, strokes, various types of cancer, dementia, diabetes, and the list goes on. And this slide is taken from the EPA. You can see since 2016, more than 2,800 publications looking at air pollution and its effect on human health. So when I say air pollution, what am I really talking about? Well, for one, I'm talking about these 6 criteria pollutants. The ones that we are most concerned about when it comes to coke making are really particulate matter and sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide, I would say, are the 3 big ones. But there are also many hazardous air pollutants that we have to think about as well. So let's focus on, for just a second, particulate matter. Particulate matter is various sizes, liquid and solid droplets that is carbon at its core, and it's a sticky, irregular surface that many other things, toxics and heavy metals, can stick to, and then they get a free ride into your body. These particles range in size, and the smaller the particle, the more health effects that it can cause. So particles with a diameter that's equal to or less than 2.5 microns is referred to as fine particles. And these ones are commonly formed through combustion, whether there's the combustion from a tailpipe of a diesel truck to a coke-making facility or other industrial facility to, just a fire. Anytime you have combustion, you have smoke, there's particles in that smoke. And these particles are very harmful to breathe in. And how harmful they are kind of depends on their composition and their oxidative potential. But I do want to reinforce the message. There is really no safe level of PM 2.5 to be breathing in. The EPA does set federal standards, but there's no healthy amount of this stuff to breathe in. You don't want to breathe any of it in if it's possible. And then, of course, when we get down to the really fine particles, the ultra-fine particles, we are talking about significant public health risk. So the impact of these particles really does vary depending on size. The larger particles that come from dust and pollen and those types of things are easier for your body to expel. You're going to sneeze, you're going to cough. But the smaller particles are going to make their way deeper into your lungs, where they can cause things like an asthma attack or even lung cancer. And then the ultrafine particles are the ones that make their way deepest into your body because they're so small they can enter your bloodstream and go directly to your brain and other organs. Another pollutant associated with coke making is sulfur dioxide. That smell that we smelled today when we came up and that we hear about a lot is that kind of a burnt match sulfury odor. That's one odor associated with the coke plant. There are other odors, but sulfur dioxide is a known irritant to respiratory health, can trigger asthma attacks, but also these sulfur particles, not only in and of themselves as a gas are a respiratory irritant, but they also can form fine particulates later on in the atmosphere, so they can cause numerous problems. And then the other odor that we talk a lot about with coke making is hydrogen sulfide. So that's this rotten egg odor that I'm not sure you might be also experiencing up here. We certainly experience it a lot where we are in Allegheny County. And there is a standard for this in Pennsylvania of 0.005 parts per million averaged over 24 hours. Now, hydrogen sulfide causes health effects, but at very high levels. It's more of a nuisance when you're smelling this and it's causing you to want to close your windows or not want to be outside. What we do know is that currently there is not an H2S monitor in Erie, in the vicinity of Erie Coke. So none of us are immune to air pollution. It negatively impacts all of us. But we do know that there are some populations that are especially vulnerable, and that includes our children, whose brains and lungs and bodies are still developing, our elderly who may have underlying health conditions that make their immune systems not as strong. Of course, those that work around pollution sources day in and day out and are getting a more concentrated dose and are not always able to wear protective gear. Of course, athletes that are running, exercising outside, if you're doing that in polluted air, you may be doing somewhat of a disservice to your body while you're trying to do a service. Pregnant women and their unborn children are especially vulnerable to air pollution and other environmental pollutants. And then, of course, where you live puts you in closer proximity to one or multiple sources of air pollution. So I would now like to turn it over to Ned Mulcahy.
I'm more boring and going to talk about regulations, which no one is ever excited to hear about. But we keep hearing Erie Coke's violating, Erie Coke's violations. It's important to understand what it is exactly that they're violating. So first step is, who are the regulatory agencies? Who are the people actually enforcing this stuff? The first is the EPA. They are Clean Air Act, federal agency. They set standards nationally. Very important, though, they do a lot of technology research with respect to setting control requirements and monitoring requirements. They're the ones that require all coke facilities to do this, all counties to monitor this. So they set the standard, so we have some sense nationwide of how it's going. The DEP are the beat cops. They're the ones actually doing the enforcement. They're the ones with inspectors on site. They're the ones actually interfacing with the industries. It's very rare for EPA to actually come out and interact with the facilities themselves. It does happen and has happened with Erie Coke, but more often than not, DEP is the primary contact for citizens' complaints for both enforcing the federal standards, and there are certain state standards like odor complaints and some visible emissions rules that are fairly state-specific, or they're not in the Federal Clean Air Act. One of their primary duties is, as Rachel mentioned, air monitoring. I apologize for the slide. It looked good on my computer, but it came out a little fuzzy. These are the only two monitors in all of Erie County. Presque Isle and right next to us. All of Erie County only has those, and if you look at the whole Northwest region, just local counties, there's a few around Warren because of United Refining having some issues. Beyond that, this is pretty much the extent of air monitoring in Erie County. As Rachel mentioned, those criteria pollutants, it's broad, they're sort of ubiquitous, they're everywhere. We're breathing these things all the time. That's what's being monitored just across the street, I guess, close by, continuously. On Presque Isle, every 6 days, they take a 24-hour sample for VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds. Think of gasoline, anything that'll dry out, alcohol, some things that evaporate quickly, and metals. Both of those are a concern from Erie Coke. So I'm a few behind. So let's talk a little bit about Erie Coke. Sorry, I have notes that I'm behind. This is why we're here. So independently owned Coke facilities. Sometimes if you look at Coke facilities, they'll say integrated. That means they give their Coke to a steelmaking facility. Erie sells theirs on the open market. Don't know their buyers. They're a major source, which means they're subject to federal rules and state rules. They have 2 batteries with 58 Coke ovens. And I felt like it's important to explain. So God bless Google. We've been using this satellite image a lot tonight. But for view, let's see if I can get here. I can't see what I'm pointing at. Okay. This, I believe that's the coal pit? Coal hole. Thank you, Mike. The coal hole. This is a diagram from one of their earlier permits. You can sort of see, I think, where, all right, so I want you to actually understand what's actually happening at the facility, which is why I'm trying to fight through this. This up here is their powerhouse, where some of their boilers are for steam. Coal comes in here. It's conveyed over to this structure, which is here. Those are the 2 batteries. Battery, well, A and B, I'm not sure which one's which. Coal is deposited. It's baked at 2,000 degrees for somewhere between 18 and 36 hours, depending on the Coke they're making. During that time, all of the nasty stuff that Mike mentioned is in coal comes oozing out of the coal to get Coke. Coke is almost pure carbon. That generates what's called coke oven gas. So, wrong button. Coke oven gas is cleaned a little and then burnt. There's a central stack in the middle. They burn it off to heat the ovens themselves. It's a reuse. Where else am I going next? When it's done baking, they open a door, push the Coke out into this car, take it over here, and quench. When you see the video of the large white plumes, it's steam. It's not exactly pure steam, but it's a lot of steam. They're pouring water on the Coke to cool it down. That's the final product. Over here are a series of Coke oven gas treatment bits. When the Coke oven gas first comes out, they spray it with water to cool it down. They pull some of the tars and benzines out. So this is where some bits of nasty are stored for treatment eventually. This facility is subject to federal rules because of their use of benzene, because of Coke ovens, and because they have boilers for heat as well. They also have state regs. So there's a lot of different regulations they're subject to. The different regulations are because, and this is an important, I already kind of said the top part, but the second part is, it's not just a single stack where they're just burning one oven and have one source. Every door, when they open and close, is a potential point of leaking. Every connection in their coke oven gas is a potential point of leaking coke oven gas, which is pretty nasty stuff. Every pipe, when they open the lid to pour coal in, every time they're opening these ovens, there's a potential for some of these different emissions to sort of leak out. We usually refer to them as fugitives. And in those fugitives, and in their final product, we're talking about a lot of stuff. Now, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, some of those are monitored at those NACs, or the ambient air monitors. Benzene, some of the more HAPs, hazardous air pollutants, are subject to leak detection, some equipment on site. The problem is, it's just a filthy process. As Mike pointed out, there's awful stuff in coal and it has to go somewhere. They're trying to burn some of it off, but ultimately they're subject to rules about how to manage that. Now, compliance sort of leads to their violations. So compliance can be measured. Direct monitoring can be monitored, or can be detected by visible human emission, or human inspectors looking at emission opacity. It can be monitored by what's called CAMs, or a continuous opacity monitor on certain stacks. There are requirements for them to report the amperage on their baghouse fans to know that their fans are always pulling out some of the emissions. That this over here is a push. When the coke's done pushing the hot baked coke out, it's still red hot. So this list, this is the most recent. I don't want to go through many of you are aware, it's got a history of being less than an ideal neighbor. I don't want to go through the entire history of everything that Erie Coke's ever done. I would be standing here way too long. The most current issue, so this was attached to the February 4th order. This list, although attached to the February 4th order, was handed to Erie Coke officials personally at a meeting November 9th, I think, or 2nd. I'm fuzzy on the date, I don't have it written down. And each one of those violations, that's just a piece of them, of the 55 violations, they were served notice each time it happened. Did a file review, spent 2 days scanning documents, ended up with over 300 documents, various things, some of them are available online. Erie is known this has been happening. They try to get to it, they don't get to it, they try to get to it, they don't, nothing keeps happening. But I know this didn't come out, I keep wanting to go point at things, I'm sorry for walking away from the mic. I have this. If you can make anything out, it says off-takes, 5%, sum of charges. Those are all federal standards. Those are all rules that say the best way to protect citizens is to have these things. Will allow you a little bit, but no. And they've continually violated either opacity, not having the right pipes connected at the right times. I have the full list. Their boiler wasn't tuned up correctly. They bypassed their H2S absorber, more fugitives crossing the property lines, opacity greater than 20%. And they continually are happening. It's worth noting that in 2009 and 10, they did pay a hefty fine. They rebuilt most of the A battery. As soon as that consent order was done in 2015, some of these issues started happening again. And it seems as though the 2015 issues weren't necessarily cleared up entirely. So we have these ongoing issues. Erie Coke is notified November 9th. They send a response, say, oh yeah, we'll get to it, and DEP is not satisfied. So that is what led to this order, the most current action on the facility, that DEP seemed to be fairly reasonable. 30 days, tell us how you're going to get back to complying with these rules. When you take this H2S absorber out of service, you need to notify us, and there's a few other things they need to do with that as far as finding a way to not release H2S into the atmosphere. Get a plan together, do some additional testing that you've skipped. They appealed. They said, no, we're going to fight it out. So that's still pending. That appeal was filed early March. That has nothing to do with the tank issue. That has nothing to do with the NOV that was filed just last week, unfortunately. And this appeal, wrong button again. The appeal is holding everything up. So the new permit won't be issued. The old permit will stand while they're sorting this out. It's impossible to predict what will happen, but at least for my portion of the presentation, that should address a little of the framework, who the players are, and where Erie Coke stands now. But as I said, Rachel's best at the inspiring words, so I'll let her finish up. Thank you.
Okay, so this is what I want to leave you with. I know there's a lot of words on the screen, but essentially what I want to say is that this facility's Title V permit is currently expired. As Ned said, they are operating with a permit. It's not as if they're operating without a permit. They're just working off the expired one. This facility has to have a new Title V permit every 5 years, and theirs expired about a year ago in March. They did get their application into the DEP on time, and it's really now the DEP's job to get this draft permit out. They're not going to issue a draft permit with all these outstanding compliance issues. So that has to be figured out first and fixed. But once this permit goes out to public comment, you will most likely only have 30 days, and they will likely have a hearing in Erie that is open to the public to attend. It'll be very, very important for all of us to be there to speak to this permit. We're going to need organizations like GASP there that can speak to the legal and the technical issues, but it is just as important that DEP hear from those of you that work, live, play, go to school in Erie, because they need to hear about how Erie Coke has been in terms of a neighbor. What have you been seeing? What have you been smelling? What have you been experiencing? And you need to let DEP know that you want nothing but the strongest permit that they can issue. And that's not enough in and of itself, because you can have the strongest permits and the strongest regulations on the books, but if they're not enforcing them, all it is a piece of paper. So you need to ask for not only a strong permit, but then also strong enforcement of the law. So that's what I'll leave you with tonight, and thank you again for having us.
And thank you, Rachel and Ned. Now I'd like you to welcome Dr. Michelle Homan, a member of HECA and professor of environmental science and an engineering researcher at Gannon University.
Okay, just quickly, as Pat said, I work at Gannon in the environmental science and engineering department, and I do air monitoring, and we actually, our department takes care of the air monitoring station out at Presque Isle State Park for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So actually we have students going out there every 6 days to take out the sampling media. They change it out and then they mail it to DEP, and then DEP analyzes it for metals and what are called hazardous air pollutants. Here's what I want to say. So Ned mentioned this briefly, and Rachel as well. There's limited air monitoring sites in Erie, so I am a big proponent of doing more air monitoring. People will ask me, so what's the air quality like in the community around Erie Coke? And is there a health concern? And my question is, my reply is, I'm not sure, because there isn't a lot of data. So what we have, as Ned mentioned, there's an air monitoring site at 10th and Marne, and that is what's called a real-time monitoring site. It kind of sits there and it collects air and it measures the 6 criteria pollutants that were listed on the slide that Rachel presented. Things like sulfur dioxide, lead, carbon monoxide, etc. If you don't have anything to do some night, you can actually go up on the website, and that data that's collected at 10th and Marne is available on the website. Hopefully you have something better to do, but anyway, it's... so that's one of the air monitoring sites. The other one, like I said, is out at Presque Isle, And that measures metals in particulates, and then it measures about 187 different hazardous air pollutants. The problem is, these two air monitoring sites, they weren't set up to measure exactly what's coming out of Erie Coke. These two sites were set up really to get an area picture of the air pollutants within the Erie area. Okay. Oh, there we go. One of the other, my animation's kind of, anyway. The other issue is that the air monitoring sites aren't in the predominant wind direction from Erie Coke. So the wind moves from a southwest area toward the northeast. And so the air monitoring sites are not really downwind of the predominant wind direction. Now, I know this is kind of a busy picture. This is actually a picture from Tonawanda, and this is Tonawanda Coke right here. What the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation did is they set up a community air monitoring study, and these three triangles here are actually air monitoring sites, and they're measuring different hazardous air pollutants, particulates, and some other air pollutants. This air monitoring site over here obviously is located upwind, so the wind is moving in this direction, and this is used as a reference site. So what's my point for comparing Tonawanda? I would like to see some more air monitoring done around Erie Coke so that we could get a better picture of what's going on in the community. The Department of Environmental Protection would be the agency to do that. They have the knowledge, they have the equipment, they've done specialized monitoring like this in other parts of the state. Just to give you a quick example, I was involved in a study in Collegeville, PA, and DEP, came in and actually measured for a chemical called TCE, trichloroethylene, in that area because there was a concern there. So that's what I'm advocating for, that there be more air monitoring, more targeted air monitoring, something like the Tonawanda model.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you, speakers. I love when I learn new things myself, and I don't know about you folks in the audience, but my head's about to explode. So I'm not going to offer any more information. I would like to point out that there are still some environmental concerns that we haven't even spoken about, and that would include some of the soil issues that could be a concern for residents living nearby. We're working with some of the folks in Tonawanda to perhaps initiate some soil testing if there are specific places in the immediate community around Erie Coke, like at playgrounds and school grounds, and if people have gardens and they're wondering now if it's safe to be eating the vegetables from their garden, we'd like to know too. Dr. Homan said, we have actually a lot more questions than we do answers about the health concerns here, and we think that we need to keep DEP aware of the fact that we need to know answers to these questions so that we don't have so much uncertainty. And that's where all of you are going to be important. So please pay attention to what goes on in the near future. And if and when we get the permits drafted, there's going to be a public hearing, and that's when we really need to have people come out. So stay engaged and report any specific things that you observe to the DEP. And I think we've provided lots of information about how to do that.